So we're on part 2 of our series that I've called The World of the Bible. And I'll guarantee you we will not cover everything about the Bible in this series, but we'll talk about some of the things that made ancient times different than our times, not just in technology and the obvious stuff, but the way people thought. And so we're going to read 3 verses to begin with. First of all, Isaiah 5, verse 8, "Woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field, until there is no more room, and you are made to dwell alone in the midst of the land." Amos 8, verse 4, "Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end." And it goes on. We won't read it, but it goes on to really condemn those people that do that. And then Micah chapter 2, verse 2, "They covet fields and seize them, and houses and take them away. They oppress a man and his house, a man and his inheritance." So the reason I chose these 3 verses, and there's a lot more, but I just thought these would work, is because they represent part of the way that Old Testament Israel viewed the idea of wealth. For people who lived in that time of history, and certainly was the case in Israel, the Old Testament, wealth was connected to land because they lived in an agriculture-based society. They weren't really industrial. They had other industries, but not a lot. And so in the vast majority of people's lives, their income was connected to their family's land and what it produced, whether crops or livestock. Now, again, that wasn't always the case. There were some people that were wealthy without being farmers, certain merchants and all that. But they were the exception. In almost every case, your money, your income was connected to your family's land. And so even years later, after these verses were written, when Jesus was in his earthly ministry, and he was teaching about the dangers of loving money, he turned in a parable to the most obvious example that everybody would have understood. He told a parable about a wealthy landowner. Let me read it to you, just part of it. Luke 12, beginning at verse 16. "He told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." So all of these verses work together, and they show us how ancient people viewed the acquisition or the building up of wealth quite a bit differently than we do. So, for example, today, if you get a little bit of extra money, you can invest it in the stock market, and if I'll use the word lucky. I'm using the word carefully. If you're lucky, you might get rich. I mean, it's happened, right? We all know people that invested in stocks and hit just the right one, and now they're millionaires. But in the world of ancient Israel, there was no such thing as a stock market. There really weren't investments like that. Or let's say you today you just really get a good idea for something, and you invent it, something that's going to revolutionize some industry, and you patent it, and you're the first one to the market. You can become a multimillionaire even if right now you're just an ordinary person. But in the world of ancient Israel, in fact, throughout the ancient world, there were no patent laws, and so anybody could copy what you had invented. And I just give those just by way of illustration to say that people in the ancient world had a different view of wealth and how you gained it than we do today. You don't have to have land today to become wealthy. You don't have to be a successful farmer to build up your assets and your bank account. It doesn't happen a lot, but we all know of people in our own society who have made millions, right? They started the right app. They founded some company. And so what that means in our society, most people believe that you can create new wealth that didn't exist before. You can create new wealth if you happen to be at the right place at the right time with the right idea. But again, it wasn't that way in the ancient world. For people in the ancient world, their mentality was there's a fixed amount of wealth available in the world, and that's because it's tied to land. You had your fields, your family had their farm, and you might have a good year or a bad year, but it wasn't going to change it that much. It could produce so much, and then it hit the limit. There was a fixed amount. And so that meant this. In their thinking, if you were getting richer, remember, there's only so much wealth available. If you were getting richer, their attitude was that meant that somebody else was becoming poorer. Because your field wasn't going to produce a whole lot more crops than previous years. And so if suddenly you're producing a lot more crops, it's because you've got more land. Well, where'd it come from? Somebody else. So that's why the Bible speaks so strongly against those in that day who took advantage, let's say, of others' misfortune by taking over their land. What are those verses we read talk about? Adding field to field. That's a phrase in there. Trampling on the needy. Taking people's inheritance. And so somebody would get in financial trouble. Well, I'll help you out, neighbor. In return, I'll take part of your land or all of it, right? And the verses we read at the beginning, I didn't read the entire context, but if you go back and read them in the context, the Bible strongly condemns this kind of behavior. That you would take somebody's land and keep it forever. In fact, if you know how it worked, in Israel, there was a year of Jubilee every 50 years where all the land that had been mortgaged, so to speak, to pay a family debt had to be returned to the original landowning family. Now, Israel didn't do a very good job following it, but that was God's intention. That was God's law. So this is the mentality people had. And I'm really emphasizing this because it helps you to understand, like, for example, the statement Jesus made in Mark chapter 10, verse 25. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. We read that and think, well, that's a little bit extreme. Like rich people with money can't go to heaven. And in our society, it does seem extreme. But again, I know I'm repeating myself, but I want to drive this home. People back then believed there's just a fixed amount of wealth available. And then there's no more. And so if you've got way more than you need, that means that you're taking resources from somebody else that could have used those resources. That's how they viewed the world. And again, it was a lot more true back then than it is now. And so Jesus, for example, he never went easy on rich people. Here's another thing he said, Luke chapter 6, verse 24. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. In other words, you've already got what you're going to get. Your comforts in this life, your consolation. It's you've got what you want, and that's going to be it. So that's the mentality of the ancient world, and it's not just Israel. Many, in fact, almost all societies back then would have fallen into that same way of thinking. Now, I want you to. We're going to do a little kind of a quick history lesson in our own history, and I want to talk about the first European settlers. Pretty much, not the only ones, but some of the first European settlers that came to America, the Puritans, right? They were fleeing the persecution from the Church of England, right? Because they had the pure religion, the Puritans, and how they viewed wealth. They did not see anything wrong with being wealthy. In fact, it was quite the opposite. They believed, and you can go back and read their books. It's all over the internet. It's available. They believed that wealth was the sign of God's blessing. The more wealth you had, the more blessed you were by God. And so what that drove them to do was to really work hard to make a lot of money as a way of showing others that God was blessing them. It was actually a religious belief of theirs. And this is a reflection of something that you've heard of called the Protestant work ethic, right? The harder you worked, the more God would bless you by increasing your wealth. And the more God blessed you, the more that demonstrated that you were a righteous person. It was kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. The more money I have, the more God has blessed me. And the only reason God blessed me is because I'm a good, righteous person who loves God. That was the mentality. And on the other hand, and again, this is all over the internet. It's a really interesting reading, these old Puritan writings. They also believed that if you were falling into poverty, right? You started out with X number of dollars and now you've got a lot less. That demonstrated that you were not righteous. And they wrote stuff about this. They said, well, if you're losing money, obviously instead of being hardworking, you're lazy. And instead of being frugal and saving your money, you're carelessly wasting it. And instead of being determined to do the right thing, you lack resolve. You have no moral character. And they actually had newspapers back then where there would be opinion columns like we have in well, I know we don't have newspapers today as much, but internet sites, right? And they would write about the social ills and poverty. And it was a very, very commonly held belief among Puritans and early American settlers that if you're poor, it's your own fault because you made bad choices. And there were these commonly held beliefs that were published and preached even, that the reason people were poor was because they didn't work hard enough to please God. And the idea was this: America is the land of opportunity. And if you try hard enough, anyone can make it. That's what they said. And during that time, there was a verse. I put it in your outline. A lot of people quoted it. Remember, a lot of people back then, whether they're actual Christians or not, we can debate that, but they claimed to be Christians, right? It was a Christian nation. And they used a verse in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 to support this view. 2 Thessalonians 3 verse 10, for even when we were with you, Paul said, we would give you this command, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. So they took that, and people would use this verse to say, well, you know what? If so-and-so is struggling to make ends meet, if they're getting into debt, if they're not keeping up, can't feed their family, it's because they don't want to work. The Bible says so. And I might debate the meaning of that, but nonetheless, that's how it was commonly held. So what I'm talking about here is the difference between views of the nature of wealth. Some societies, and we're still kind of this way, mostly. In our society, we see wealth as something that can be created. New wealth can be created and it can be expanded without robbing anybody else. But other societies, and there are parts of the world that are this way still even today, they see wealth as a limited resource. There's only so much, and whatever I take or whatever I make means somebody else is losing that amount. Now, I'm not going to get political tonight, and I'm not going to argue about views of how the economy works. And the point I am making is not that one view is right and the other view is wrong. All I'm doing is pointing out what people in the ancient world believed. Because when you understand that mentality, that puts you in the best position to interpret accurately what the Bible says. Okay, so I'm not here to argue about economic theory, but I'm saying our view of morality and wealth and how they work together, the morality of wealth and the morality of making money, it plays a role in the way that we interpret certain scriptures. So we might, as 21st century Americans, read a passage, and based on our societal beliefs, we might interpret it a certain way. But it might be that the biblical author had something else in mind. And I'm just going to limit this to money and wealth tonight. And so here's an example. There's a verse in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9. I kind of want to work through it because it's kind of a little illustration of how this plays in. Paul says, he's giving a list of instructions for people in the church, and it's in Ephesus. Timothy is the pastor of the Ephesian church. And in verse 9 he says, likewise also that women, so he's talking about Christian women in the church, should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire. So I have heard pastors and Bible scholars Westerners, Americans, teach that Paul is talking about two separate issues here. First of all, they say, well, Paul is saying that women should not wear revealing clothing in church. That's the phrase, adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control. In other words, Paul's saying don't commit in the ancient equivalent of a miniskirt or halter top or something like that. And I've heard this, okay? And then they say the second issue he's addressing is that they shouldn't dress in a way that shows off their wealth, and that's the phrase, not with braided hair, because getting your hair done back then was an expensive thing. An ordinary woman could not afford that. And so this is not just talking about, putting a braid, but a hairdo. Not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire. But here's how I read it. And you may not agree with me, but we'll talk about it afterward, if you like. When I read this passage in the context of 1 Timothy as a whole, I do not think Paul is changing subjects here at all. I think he's staying on the same idea. And that in verse 9, the word modesty is talking about being modest with your wealth. Not modest in terms of not wearing revealing clothing, but being modest in your wealth. It's like that old expression, how would you use that word? He's someone of modest means. In other words, someone that doesn't have a lot of money. I think that's kind of the way Paul's using it. And why do I say that? Because in 1 Timothy, you have to remember, a large part of what Paul is doing throughout the book is talking about the qualifications of leaders in the early church. And this ties into the where they met. Remember, and I don't know how often we've talked about this, but back in the early days of the church, there really weren't church buildings to speak of. People worshiped in private homes. And the only way they could do that would be if someone in the church had enough wealth that they could afford to live in a large house with enough room to hold a group of people in kind of like we're here, If we tried to fit in my house, you'd all go to the Baptist church. You see what I'm saying? You had to find somebody that had a pretty good size church. And I think what Paul was doing here, and I'll talk about it a little more and explain a little more detail. I think Paul was telling in this verse that the women in these families, the wife of the homeowner, that he was telling these women to think carefully about how they presented themselves when the church gathered for worship. He was telling them not to make an ostentatious show of their wealth and to be careful not to do anything that would make other Christians who didn't have money feel inferior. Let's read it again and see if you see where I'm going. 1 Timothy 2, verse 9. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control. And he's continuing the same thought when he says, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire. It's all one thought. I do not see a change in subject. Don't dress in a way that says, I have money and I'm going to make sure you know that I have money. And this interpretation fits the overall context because in the very next chapter, Paul switches gears and he talks to men in leadership. And listen to what he says to them. 1 Timothy 3, verses 2 and 3. Therefore, an overseer, or that's the Greek word episkopos, which means it's translated bishop. And it's not episkopos, not bishop, like an elder. And so it's somebody in leadership. He says an overseer must be above reproach, husband of one wife. We're all familiar with this, right? Sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, and what? Not a lover of money. And think about the context. You're meeting in somebody's house. Very likely, because of that individual is going to have some role of leadership in the church. It's his house. It's her house. Paul says to the women, adorn yourselves modestly. You don't have to show up with the gold and pearls and costly clothing. He says to the men who want to be leaders, don't be a lover of money. Don't trumpet your desire to have more and more and to let people know that you're on your way up in the world. But I've always heard it interpreted differently, the word modesty. Our church culture, it's changing now, because our society is going into the toilet morally, let's be honest. But I grew up being taught in Assemblies of God churches, and I'm sure the Baptists and the not Methodists, but the Baptists and the Nazarenes and all them were the same way. I grew up being taught that sexual modesty, the way a woman covers her body, is necessary. And I would agree with that. But that modesty about wealth, well, that's good, but not essential. Nobody said that, but it was never the thing. It's that women should cover themselves. And if you will go back far enough in Pentecostal history, no makeup, right? For women especially. But it wasn't so much a big thing about not dressing well in a way that says, hey, I've got money. In fact, we were taught, you do your best for God. You wear your best for God. And I'm not against that. I'm just saying modesty about wealth was not a big deal in the churches I grew up in. I never heard a pastor talk about it. Whereas in the Bible, modesty about wealth was not only strongly taught, it was demanded, as we just read, of those in a leadership role. Don't show up in clothing that says, hey, I've got a lot of money. And I think it's really interesting, going back to the Puritans, and where I talked about them a little bit. They had really, really strict rules, especially for women, about modesty of appearance. Puritan women were forbidden anytime, but especially in church, from wearing clothing that revealed too much. If a Puritan woman wanted to get in trouble, show up in anything that didn't meet the standard of completely covering what she looked like. Whereas modesty about money was something that they didn't worry about. In fact, their lives proclaimed the opposite. Let me give you an example. You remember I told you one of the reasons the Puritans came to the New World, America, was to flee the persecution they were experiencing from the Church of England, the Anglican Church. But when they got to America, they kept one practice from the Anglicans, and that was the purchasing of church pews. You could pay the church to reserve a pew for you and your family. And sometimes they'd put your name on it, put a little plaque there. And that was for your use alone. And the more you were able to pay, the closer to the front of the church your family pew would be, where everybody could see it. So the Puritans would walk into church with their bodies modestly covered, which I think was a good idea. And yet they were still making, listen, a public spectacle of themselves. And not only did they have the best pews in church, some of them, in many cases, and you can read about this, this isn't hidden history, it's out there. Those people in many cases were seated first before the service began. They were escorted down to their pew, and only after they were seated were the others allowed to come in and take their seats. So it was not uncommon. We're righteous. God is blessing us. That's why we have this money, and we're going to let you know we have money. So they're claiming to follow scriptural teaching about modesty, but I think they were missing something just as important, which is wealth, modesty about wealth. You remember what James said? Chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down by my feet, have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? And still today, it's not as bad now. I mean, look at me. But it's not completely disappeared from our churches. We're real big on teaching that women should be modest. Don't wear revealing clothing that might tempt men. But I think we're missing something else, which is being modest about the way we display our wealth. Not that Paul was okay with immodest, revealing clothing. He wasn't. He wasn't okay with that. But just that I think showing off your money can be just as sinful as showing off your body. Just a different kind of sin. And God isn't pleased with either one of those behaviors. Both of them are dangerous to our spiritual health. So, again, I haven't covered everything the Bible teaches about wealth and the attitude toward it, but I thought it'd be a good introduction, a good thing to get us started thinking about how we approach wealth, what we do, especially in the context of the church. The reason the Bible talks about brothers and sisters, it's become a term of respect almost in our culture, but back then it was a term of equality. Brother, sister, equals. That's the ideal. And you're not better because you have money. You're not worse because you don't have money. We're all the same before Jesus at the foot of the cross.